June 1863, Chattanooga. A mud-streaked carbine lay on a workbench that was never meant to host miracles. The officer who brought it in had pulled it off a fallen Federal trooper at the edge of a wheat field. It looked ungainly. The stock seemed too thick. The magazine hid in the butt like a magician's trick. The lever was a question mark, daring the hand to answer. A sergeant flicked the action open. Brass flashed. A copper cartridge fell into his palm like a coin from the future. He rolled it between thumb and forefinger, listened to it clink on the bench, and said what many officers on both sides would say before the war was done. "We will never match that." The Spencer repeater did not shout its revolution. It clicked it, one lever stroke at a time. A rifleman with ordinary skill could deliver 7 shots in a smooth, unbroken rhythm, then feed the magazine from a tin tube and do it again. It did not ask a man to bite paper, spill powder, ram a ball, and prime a cap with frozen fingers while a line bore down. It asked him to move a lever and think about targets, not rituals. That was the insult that stung most. The Spencer removed the long ceremony of loading from battle. It replaced ritual with a mechanism. To see why that mattered, remember the world the Spencer entered. Across the continent, men fought with muzzle-loading rifles and smoothbores that rewarded patience and punished haste. Under ideal drill, a good soldier might fire 2 or 3 rounds per minute, perhaps 4 in bursts of desperation, with misfires reminding him that the gods of humidity and fouling demanded tribute. Every step of the process introduced risk: a torn cartridge, a damp cap, a ramrod dropped in the grass, a nervous hand that double-charged a barrel and split it. The muzzle-loader was a weapon and a ceremony. The Spencer was simply a weapon. Now we are back at the bench. The engineers in gray clean the captured piece and begin to strip it with the curiosity that makes engineers dangerous. Out come the screws, the side plates, the breech block, the springs. The lever linkage opens like a book. The magazine tube slides, revealing its spring and follower. The chamber is short and stout. The rifling is clean. They measure angles with calipers, and they weigh the bolt on a scale that usually counts nails. They do not say much. They do not need to. The truth is in the pieces that lie on the oiled cloth. This carbine is not a magic wand. It is a set of honest parts manufactured to a standard and joined in a way that rewards repetition. One of them picks up the cartridge again. It is not a paper tube. It is not a cloth bag. It is a copper case with a rim filled with powder, capped with a bullet, with its primer hidden in the very edge of the cup. The rim is the switch. The firing pin crushes that rim, and the primer wakes the powder. No percussion cap, no separate priming step, no exposed vulnerability to rain in the middle of the cycle. Here is the quiet genius. The cartridge itself closes the system. It is a tiny sealed engine that carries its own spark. Run the math, because math is where this story keeps its teeth. A muzzle loader demands roughly 15 motions per shot, each with a chance to go wrong, each eating seconds like a hungry animal. A Spencer demands 2 motions and a mind calm enough to keep the barrel on target. Over 60 seconds, a steady man with a muzzle loader will give you 2 or 3 aimed shots. Over the same minute, a steady man with a Spencer will give you 12 or 14. If the minute stretches with adrenaline and luck, the muzzle loader might squeeze out 4, while the Spencer can still deliver a dozen. Multiply by a company frontage, And you do not get a skirmish. You get a weather system of lead. Now the engineers confront the question that command wants answered. Can we build this? Not can one gunsmith copy a shape. Can a nation produce the parts, the tools, the gauges, the springs, the cases, and the cartridges in the numbers required to turn a battlefield from ceremony to mechanism? One man clears his throat and points at the parts that look easy. Woodstocks, barrels, hammers, levers. With time, good iron, and skilled hands, any nation that can build a farm can build those. Then he points at the parts that are not easy. Heat-treated springs with reliable temper. Precisely bored breech blocks that do not peen themselves to death after 100 cycles. Firing pins that strike the rim with the right force at the right angle. Machine screws that fit because the tap and die that cut the threads were made to a standard and kept to that standard over hundreds of tools. And above all, this copper cup that is somehow thin enough to expand and seal the gas, thick enough not to tear, soft enough to crush for the primer, hard enough to survive transport, and cheap enough to make by the thousands every day. Metallurgy is not a rumor. It is a workshop full of rolling mills, annealing furnaces, and men who can judge the temper of a spring without breaking it. It is a factory with dies that draw copper into cups, then draw those cups into longer cups, then trim, anneal, and wash them before a primer is spun into the rim. It is a chemical house where fulminate is made carefully enough to stay alive and mixed carefully enough to behave. It is lacquer that keeps moisture out. It is uniformity, because uniformity is the hidden guarantee of a repeating weapon. If one cartridge in 20 fails, a muzzle loader swears and tries another. If one cartridge in 20 sticks in a repeater, the entire advantage collapses at the worst possible moment. The engineer who has been silent puts the cartridge on the table and taps the rim with the tip of a file. The metal dents and holds the dent. He nods. "This is good copper," he says softly. "We do not draw this kind of cup in any quantity." And there it is, the first admission that matters. The mechanical problem of levers and bolts can be solved with clever machinists and time. The industrial problem of copper cups and uniform primers cannot be solved by a clever man at a single bench. It requires a civilization of benches arranged into a factory and a factory arranged into a system. On the far side of the lines, that system exists. Northern arsenals and private firms have rolling mills that make strip stock in reliable gauges. They have presses with dies that can deep draw thousands of cups per day, men who know when to anneal to prevent cracks, and enough copper supply to keep the presses busy. They have chemists who learn to make primer compounds in batches that will not kill the maker and will still flash when struck. They have gauges and gauges for the gauges, so that every dimension repeats across machines and months. When a spring breaks, a bin holds another with the same song when plucked. When a bolt wears, a shelf holds its twin. The union does not rely on miracles, it relies on sameness. Sameness is the miracle that the Spencer needs. All of this would be meaningless, of course, if the weapon did not change the way the war felt to the men who faced it. It did. Somewhere on a ridge in Tennessee, a regiment in gray steps out of wooded ground into a field where the grass swallows knees. They expect the usual exchange, one volley, smoke. Then the pause while the enemy falls to the work of biting, pouring, ramming, capping. In that pause, you close distance or you slip away. But the pause does not come. The enemy line does not bend to loading. It flexes and breathes and keeps firing, a taut wire of sound across the field. A color bearer pitches forward and another lifts the flag, and then another man takes a bullet as he runs to fill the gap. The assault that should have broken through a cycle of loading instead dissolves against a constant percussion. In the reports that follow, there will be courage in abundance. There will be no mention of a pause, because the pause never appeared. We need to talk about ammunition, because the Spencer's gift is also its appetite. A man who can fire rapidly will fire rapidly, and a line that can sustain that rate will pour rounds as long as tin tubes appear. The Union learned to feed that appetite. Depot officers stacked cases marked with 7 tube packs and counted them by the thousands. Cartridges moved by rail and water to brigades that trained with them, learned their quirks, and marched to battle already comfortable with the rhythm of lever, sight, press. The Confederacy could capture repeaters, and they did, and men who held them fought with the joy of a new toy. But after a few fights, they stood at a wagon and watched the last rimmed copper disappear into someone else's pouch, and then the repeater went quiet because the Army did not produce that caliber and that cartridge in any number. A weapon without a supply chain is a museum piece that still smells of powder. Confederate attempts to match the effect took 2 main paths. The first path tried to improve what they already had: better caps, better paper, tighter tolerances in Enfield copies and Richmond rifles, Sharp's carbines where they could maintain them. The second path went sideways into designs that used what was available. Revolving rifles existed, but they had a habit of sending flame into the hand that cradled the fore-end when powder chain fired across a cylinder. Novel breech-loaders were sketched and sometimes built in small numbers, but each design asked for something the South had little of: better steel, better gauges, more copper, more chemistry. An inventor's ingenuity can get a prototype on a colonel's desk. It cannot feed an army. There were clever Confederate answers at the tactical level. Officers learned to close faster, to use woods and folds in ground, to avoid long walks across open fields that gave repeaters a minute to saw through ranks. Sharpshooters picked at the men who carried the odd-looking carbines, because killing the man with the magazine could subtract 12 bullets from a minute. Artillery worked to smash firing lines with canister before they chewed the cannoneers into silence. Cavalry learned to dismount and skirmish rather than charge straight into a wall of level muzzles. These were real adaptations. They saved lives. They bent the graph. They did not change the graph's slope. Back in the shop, the engineers continue their teardown report. The Spencer's magazine is simple, a spring and follower in a tube, but the spring steel is consistent. The feed lips are forgiving. The bolt face picks up the rim firmly. The extractor does not try to do too much. The firing pin strikes the rim at a place that lights the primer rather than pushing the case forward. The parts were made with jigs, not by eye. The tolerances are tight where they must be and loose where they should be. The weapon was designed to be built by many hands in many hours, not by one master in a month. This, they admit, is the most foreign part of the device. It was not made for a craftsman's vanity. It was made for a foreman's schedule. That schedule is a weapon. A machine that returns from repair in a day is a weapon that lives. A machine that waits a week for a spring is a promise broken under fire. Northern depots could replace a broken Spencer part because the parts were not unique. Southern depots often could not because each musket seemed to carry the soul of the man who built it. The romance of a hand-fitted arm is powerful at a fair. It is a curse in a war of months and miles. Let us run the math again in a different way, because the numbers are a chorus that will not stop singing. Imagine two companies of equal courage facing each other across 200 yards. One has muzzle loaders, one has Spencers. Both begin to fire. In the first 15 seconds, each Spencer sends 2 or 3 rounds with sights steady and minds calm, while the muzzle loaders raise their long arms to begin the dance of powder and cloth. In 30 seconds, the Spencers have put perhaps 5 or 6 rounds from each man into the space ahead, some missing, some finding shirts, some biting wood and bone, while the first volley from the muzzle loaders is only now rising as caps snap home. In a minute, the Spencer Company has made a volume of fire that turns the ground into a problem set of trajectories. The muzzle loaders finally contribute their disciplined volleys, but their aim is now broken by the fact that they are fewer and breathless and frightened. Courage fights numbers. Numbers win when the weapons let numbers speak without pause. Opponents tried to argue that the repeater would waste ammunition, that men with a lever could not help but yank it, spraying lead into smoke. There is truth in the concern. Any weapon that multiplies shots tempts the finger, but waste only matters if you cannot replace what you spend. The Union could, and so the only waste that truly counted was a missed opportunity. The Confederacy could not, and so every captured repeating carbine was a burst of thunder followed by a long silence. In their own memos, officers admit this without drama. The weapon is good. The cartridge we cannot make. Therefore, we cannot make the weapon good for us. Why could they not make the cartridge? Copper supply existed in the South, but the industrial chain to turn ore into strip, strip into cups, cups into drawn cases, and cases into sealed rounds was too thin, too slow, and too easily broken by raids, by shortages, and by the tyranny of time. Deep drawing of copper is an art that becomes a science only with repetition, tooling, and heat treatment, controlled by more than an eye on a color and a nose for the smell of hot metal. Primer chemistry is unforgiving. A small error in fulminate production can kill a worker and burn a workshop. A cautious manager will slow the line to save his men. A rushed manager will bury them and still deliver inconsistent primer pellets that die in storage or ignite when they should not. None of this is an insult. It is simply the truth that revolutions in small metal often require large factories. Meanwhile, the battlefield kept serving demonstrations. Mounted infantry armed with repeaters held gaps that should have buckled. Dismounted troopers with 7 shots discouraged cavalry charges with a noise and a rhythm that broke horses as much as men. Skirmishers on a ridge forced regiments to deploy at longer distances than before, costing precious minutes and adding fatigue that men carry in their legs into the main fight. At points in the war, a few Southern outfits carried captured Spencers and loved them. Their letters glow. Then the glow dims as the cartridges run dry. Some tried to reload rimfire cases with improvised tools and home-brewed priming. A few succeeded in a limited way in the quiet behind the lines. On campaign, the practice proved rare and dangerous. A weapon that depends on miracles will fail on the week you most need a miracle. Think about maintenance for a moment, because repeaters demand a marriage between design and care. Soot and fouling find corners and build crust. Springs weaken when overheated by a careless smith's lantern. Screws back out unless men are taught to check them. In armies that standardized the training, the weapon stayed faithful. In armies that left it to chance, the weapon punished the lazy. Once again, the gap between the sides was not just metal. It was the teaching that followed the metal, the book that told a corporal how to strip and oil and reassemble, and what to do when an extractor chipped at the corner. The Union printed those books and shipped them with the weapons. The Confederacy had good manuals where they could print them, and good sergeants where they could keep them. It did not have enough of both together, often enough to turn a repeating system into a routine. There is a temptation to imagine a brilliant Confederate counter that never came to fruition, a secret shop that would have matched the Spencer shot for shot if the war had lasted longer or if some shipment had arrived. The record resists that fantasy. Clever designs existed and small batches appeared, but the thing that the Spencer required most was not cleverness. It was sameness. Sameness needs time and money and trained hands and machines that measure other machines. The South fought a war while trying to build an economy that could have fed such sameness. War devours the time required to build anything but graves. Listen to an imagined conversation at that bench in Chattanooga. The officer asks the head engineer what it would take to make 500 of these in a month. The engineer does not laugh. He says we would need stock for barrels, jigs for levers, reamers we do not possess for chambers, a gauge to check the rim depth so the firing pin does not pierce the case, dies to draw cups that we cannot cut with the lathes we have, copper in quantities we cannot buy at prices we cannot promise to pay, and a place to make primer where a single mistake would take the roof and the crew. The officer nods and asks what it would take to make 5,000. The engineer says it would take a different nation. The story is not only mechanics and factories, it is also fear and respect. Men who faced the Spencer learned to hear the difference. A line of muzzle loaders makes thunder in discrete rolls, each volley a bookend for the next movement. A line of repeaters is a saw. It bites and keeps biting. That sound changes behavior. It keeps heads down longer. It makes a sergeant pause before he rises to shout and wave a hat. It makes a lieutenant estimate distance wrong because he is calculating under an invisible pressure. Weapons that change sound change time. When you shorten the time between shots with a reliable machine, you reach into the enemy's head and steal seconds that he cannot buy back with courage. We should linger on how rate of fire actually translates into ground. Not all bullets are equal. Bullets that arrive while the enemy is still forming do more work than bullets that arrive after he is already falling back. The Spencer's real gift is not 7 shots before a reload. It is 7 shots in the most valuable slice of time in a small fight, the first 30 seconds when one side can impose its will before the other side settles into its routine. The carbine seizes that slice and fills it with decisions made on the move. That is how skirmish lines push lines off good ground without bayonets. That is how mounted infantry hold a road against a larger force long enough for infantry boots to arrive. That is how a regiment with repeaters can appear to be bigger than it is. None of this is free, even for the side that owns the weapon. The Union paid in powder and lead and the labor to shape them, in rolling mills that wore out bearings, in the accidents that training and caution reduce but cannot prevent. But the Union could afford to buy time with metal. The Confederacy could not. The engineers who finished their report in that warm shop with the acetous smell of oil on cloth knew this. They recommended that captured Spencers be issued to scouts and picked men where cartridges might be found in enemy wagons. They recommended that industry focus on improving known patterns rather than chasing miracles that required copper miracles to feed them. And they recommended that tactics continue to adapt to a world where the pause after a volley might not come when you expect it. The long view adds its own judgment. After the war, many Spencers were converted from rimfire to centerfire to stretch their service and to make cartridges easier to produce in the next industrial decade. That detail is less important than the habit it reveals. Weapons that are systems can be upgraded when the system that feeds them upgrades. The Confederacy could not make the system in time. It is not a moral failing. It is a calendar and a map. We return to the bench one last time. The pieces lie ordered now, cleaned and measured. The engineer with the calm voice assembles the carbine with the care of a man closing a well-read book. He inserts a handful of cartridges and works the lever. The action is smooth, the spring pushes, the extractor grasps. The firing pin falls onto not quite empty chambers because there is no reason to waste precious rounds in a shop. He lowers the hammer and looks up. "Give this to men who can aim and feed them from a depot that can count," he says, "and they will sing. We can teach men to aim. We cannot build the depot. Not now. Not with what we have." He does not add the last sentence aloud. The Union can. The battlefield remembers what the bench admitted. Every time a hillside of blue lifted 7 rifles and stitched a ravine with fast, repeating shots, every time a picket line turned a charge into a stumble, the lesson spread. Fire without pause is a new animal. It runs faster than a line can chase. It turns courage into casualties at a rate that a commander cannot forgive. It requires, behind it, a city of parts and powders that a young nation at war could not raise in time. So here is the verdict, spoken without bitterness. The Spencer was a simple machine made powerful by a complex supply chain. Confederate engineers took it apart, admired its honesty, and told the truth that mattered. We can copy the shapes. We cannot copy the speed because the speed lives in copper and chemistry and gauges and men trained to use them. We will fight as well as we can with the rifles we can build. We will kill what we can reach. But we cannot match that rhythm. Not now, not here, not in time. And yet, even in that admission, there is a kind of respect that good engineers share across lines. They saw a mechanism that did what it promised. They saw a design that forgave dirt and fear. They saw a weapon that did not ask a man to be a priest at an altar of powder, but allowed him to be a soldier who thought about ground and angle and breath. If you must lose to a machine, better to lose to an honest one. The men in that shop wrapped the carbine in oiled cloth and sent it back to the cavalry with a note. "Use this when cartridges appear in capture. Care for the spring. Keep the chamber clean. Do not forget that it is hungry." The note was pragmatic, almost tender. The war was not. But sometimes the voice of a careful man survives the thunder. It tells us what mattered, and it explains why. even with courage stamped on every regiment's flag. Some battles end in arithmetic. Take the math with you. 2 motions against 15, 12 rounds against 3, 7 shots before a reload against 1. Those are just numbers until you put men underneath them. Then they become outcomes. Then they become stories told as warnings and as lessons. Then they become the memory of a ridge where the pause never came, and the line that expected it broke instead. The Spencer's lever was a small thing. It made a larger thing possible. It taught one side to trust sameness, and the other side to fear appetite. It forced officers to redraw diagrams, and it forced quartermasters to build bigger ledgers. It did not win the war alone. Nothing does. But in the months when it mattered most, it shortened time for the men who held it and lengthened time for the men who faced it. Time is the only currency no army can mint. Confederate engineers took apart a captured Spencer and counted its parts. They also counted the factories they did not have, the copper they could not draw, the primers they could not guarantee, and the trains they could not run on schedule. They admitted what their hands already knew: they would not match its rate of fire. And in that admission we can hear the sound that carried across fields and through workshops, the relentless clicking that turned a minute into a weapon. That sound is the end of this story, and the beginning of another, the story of weapons built as systems and nations compelled to become systems to use them well. So when you hear the word repeater, do not think only of a lever and a magazine. Think of rolling mills, of gauges, of jigs, of careful men with calipers and notebooks, of chemists with steady hands and safer rooms, of trains with schedules and depots with clerks who can count to a very large number without losing their place. Think of soldiers whose fingers learned a rhythm and whose officers learned to plan around that rhythm. Think of enemies who felt that rhythm in their bones and changed their behavior because of it. Think of a bench where men in gray spoke the truth. We cannot match that. And think of a battlefield that agreed with them, one instant and one copper rim at a time.